Have you ever bought something cheap and then realized the reason it was so cheap is because someone cut corners that could get you killed? Well, in 1970, Ford Motor Company sold America a car for just $2,000. It was small. It was cute. They called it the little carefree car. And within 2 years, people were burning alive inside of it. This is the story of how one of the biggest automakers on the planet knowingly sold a death trap to millions of families, did the math on human life, and decided that paying for funerals was cheaper than fixing the problem. If that doesn't make your blood run cold, stick around, because it gets worse. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's get into it. So to understand how the Ford Pinto became one of the most infamous vehicles ever built, you have to go back to the late 1960s. The American auto industry was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble where sales dip a little, and executives have to skip their second vacation home. Real trouble. Foreign imports, specifically from Volkswagen, Toyota, and Datsun, were flooding into the United States, and American consumers were eating them up. These little cars were fuel-efficient, affordable, and practical. And the big three in Detroit, well, they were still building land yachts with V8 engines and chrome bumpers the size of park benches. Ford's answer to this invasion was supposed to come from one man, Lee Iacocca. Now, if you know anything about automotive history, you know that name. Iacocca was already a legend inside Ford. He was the guy who created the Mustang, one of the most successful car launches in history. He had an almost supernatural ability to read the market and give people what they wanted before they even knew they wanted it. By the late 60s, he was Ford's executive vice president and rapidly climbing toward the presidency of the entire company. And Iacocca looked at those little imports stealing market share and said, essentially, we need our own cheap small car, and we need it yesterday. His vision was specific. The car had to weigh no more than 2,000 pounds. It had to cost no more than $2,000, and it had to be on dealer lots in time for the 1971 model year. That last requirement was the killer. See, developing a new car from scratch typically took about 43 months. That was the industry standard. Iacocca wanted it done in 25, nearly half the time. And he wasn't asking, he was telling. Inside Ford, the project quickly became known as Lee's car. And when Lee wanted something, you didn't push back. One engineer later recalled that nobody dared go to Iacocca and tell him the gas tank was unsafe. That person would have been fired. Safety wasn't a popular subject around Ford in those days. With Lee, it was taboo. His favorite saying at the time summed up the entire philosophy. Safety doesn't sell. So the clock started ticking, and the engineers got to work under impossible pressure. The man tasked with actually making Iacocca's vision a reality was Robert Alexander, the chief engineer for the Pinto project. And from day one, Alexander and his team were caught between a rock and a very expensive hard place. Iacocca's 2,000 and 2,000 rule, 2,000 pounds and $2,000, wasn't a guideline. It was a commandment. Every single component, every design decision, every bolt and bracket had to serve that number. And when you're trying to build a car that light and that cheap in that little time, something has to give. What gave was safety. The rushed 25-month timeline meant that several development processes that normally happened one after another were happening simultaneously. Machine tooling overlapped with product development, which meant the basic design got frozen early. Once the assembly line machinery was set up, making major changes became enormously expensive and time-consuming. So decisions that might threaten the schedule were actively discouraged. The attitude from the top was clear: get this car out the door as fast as humanly possible. One of the most critical decisions made during this frantic development phase involved the fuel tank. Engineers placed it behind the rear axle, sandwiched between the axle and the rear bumper. Now, to be fair, this wasn't an unusual placement for American cars at the time. Plenty of subcompacts had their fuel tanks in roughly the same spot. But the Pinto's version of this layout had some uniquely dangerous characteristics. There were only about 9 inches of crush space between the rear bumper and the fuel tank. That's barely wider than a dinner plate. The tank's filler neck was prone to detaching on impact, which would spray gasoline everywhere. And here's the really nasty part. There were bolts protruding from the differential housing right next to the tank. In a rear-end collision, those bolts could puncture the tank like a can opener going through a tin of sardines. The fuel tank's walls were thin and lacked any meaningful reinforcement. Sharp edges from surrounding components posed additional rupture risks. And if all of that wasn't enough, the Pinto's doors had a tendency to jam shut after a collision, trapping occupants inside while fuel leaked and ignited around them. It was, in the most literal sense, a perfect storm of engineering compromises that turned into a perfect death trap. Here's where the story goes from troubling to truly disturbing. Ford didn't stumble into this problem blindly. They knew. They knew before the first Pinto ever rolled off the assembly line. Ford secretly crash-tested the Pinto more than 40 times before it went on the market. And in every single test conducted at speeds above 25 miles per hour, the fuel tank ruptured. Every single one. Let that sink in for a moment. They ran the tests. They saw the results. The gas tank split open and leaked fuel in test after test after test. And they sold the car anyway. During pre-production testing, engineers discovered that even at relatively low speeds, a rear-end impact could push the fuel tank forward into the differential housing, where those protruding bolts would puncture it. Fuel would spray into and around the passenger compartment, and any spark, whether from metal scraping against metal, an electrical short, or even the friction of the collision itself, could turn the whole thing into an inferno. Harley Kopp, a lead Ford test engineer and the former head of Ford's crash testing program, later became one of the most important whistleblowers in automotive history. During court testimony, Kopp revealed that senior management at Ford, including Iacocca himself, were fully aware of the crash test results. They knew the gas tank was vulnerable to puncture and rupture at low rear impact speeds, creating a significant risk of death or injury from fire. And they also knew that fixes were feasible at what Kopp described as nominal cost. Kopp didn't mince words. He later called the Pinto grossly inadequate and the weakest car I've seen in the last 10 to 12 years. But by the time the testing revealed these problems, the assembly line tooling was already set. The design was frozen, and the clock was still ticking on Iacocca's 25-month deadline. So what did Ford do? They looked at the numbers, and they made a choice. Ford's engineers actually came up with several solutions to the fuel tank problem, and this is the part that makes the whole thing so infuriating, because none of them were expensive. They could have lined the fuel tank with a rubber or nylon bladder, a sort of inner liner that would prevent fuel from leaking even if the outer tank was punctured. Cost between $5.25 and $8 per vehicle. They could have added structural reinforcement to the rear of the car to better protect the tank during impacts. Cost about $4.20 per vehicle. They could have placed a simple plastic baffle between the fuel tank and the differential housing, basically a shield to keep those killer bolts from puncturing the tank. Cost $2.35 per vehicle. And here's the one that really stings. During testing, engineers found that a 1-pound, $1 piece of plastic could prevent the gas tank from being punctured in rear impacts. $1. $1 single dollar per car. But even that was rejected as extra cost and extra weight under Iacocca's strict 2000 and 2000 rule. Ford also held a patent on a significantly safer fuel tank design. They owned the technology, it was sitting right there. And they chose not to use it because it would have added cost and potentially delayed the production schedule. Instead of implementing any of these fixes, Ford's management turned to a different kind of calculation entirely. They produced what has become known as the Pinto Memo, one of the most infamous documents in corporate history. It was a cost-benefit analysis that laid out, in cold, clinical numbers, the financial argument for doing nothing. The analysis estimated that the fuel tank modification would cost about $11 per vehicle, spread across the roughly 12.5 million cars and light trucks that would be affected. The total cost came to approximately $137 million. On the other side of the ledger, Ford estimated the benefits of the modification. They calculated there would be roughly 180 burn deaths, 180 serious burn injuries, and 2,100 burned vehicles. Using figures provided by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, they assigned a value of $200,000 per death, $67,000 per serious injury, and $700 per vehicle. The total benefit, approximately $49.5 million. The math was simple: $137 million in costs versus $49.5 million in benefits. According to Ford's own analysis, it was cheaper to let people burn. On September 11, 1970, Ford introduced the Pinto to the American public. They marketed it with advertising campaigns calling it the little carefree car. The irony of that tagline would become devastating. Early reviews were actually positive. Car and driver praised its handling and compared the driving experience to something approaching a sports car feel. At a base price of just $1,850, the Pinto was the cheapest new car in America. Customers flocked to dealerships. Sales climbed rapidly. The Pinto was offered in 3 body styles: a 2-door fastback sedan, a 3-door hatchback, and a 2-door station wagon. It came with a choice of small inline 4-cylinder engines, initially a 1.6-liter sourced from Ford's English division, and a 2.0-liter from the German side. These were modest little power plants, nothing flashy, designed for economy rather than performance. The car accelerated from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 10.8 seconds with the larger engine, which was respectable for a budget subcompact. And for a while, everything seemed fine. The Pinto sold like crazy. Over its 10-year production run, Ford would manufacture more than 3 million of them, outproducing both the Chevrolet Vega and the AMC Gremlin combined. But beneath the cheerful marketing and the climbing sales figures, the clock was ticking. Reports of fiery rear-end collisions started trickling in almost immediately, and the trickle would soon become a flood. The first major tragedy to make headlines came in May of 1972, less than 2 years after the Pinto launched. Lily Gray was driving her 1972 Ford Pinto on a Southern California freeway near San Bernardino. In the passenger seat was her neighbor, 13-year-old Richard Grimshaw. At some point, the engine stalled, and the car slowed to a stop on the freeway. Another vehicle struck the Pinto from behind. The impact speed was estimated at somewhere around 28 miles per hour. Not particularly fast. The kind of impact that, in most cars, would leave you with a sore neck and a dented bumper. But this was a Pinto. On impact, the fuel tank ruptured. Gasoline sprayed everywhere. The car erupted into flames almost instantly. Lily Gray suffered catastrophic burns and died several days later in the hospital. Richard Grimshaw survived, but barely. He sustained burns over 90% of his body, including his face. His nose, one ear, and several fingers were incinerated. He was permanently disfigured and would undergo multiple corrective surgeries over the next decade. He was 13 years old. The Grimshaw family and Lily Gray's heirs, her husband and 2 daughters, sued Ford Motor Company. And what came out during the trial would shock the nation. The plaintiff's attorneys presented Ford's internal cost-benefit documents. They called Harley Kopp to the stand, and he testified for 2 weeks about what Ford's management knew and when they knew it. He told the court that the highest levels of Ford's management made the decision to go forward with production, knowing the gas tank was vulnerable, knowing people could die, and knowing that fixes were available at minimal cost. The jury was horrified. They awarded $127.8 million in damages. That included $125 million in punitive damages alone, making it the largest product liability award in American history at that time. The jury's reasoning for that specific number was devastating. They wanted the punitive damages to exceed the total profit Ford had made on the Pinto since its introduction, which was $124 million. They wanted to take back every penny Ford had earned from selling a car they knew could kill. The trial judge later reduced the punitive damages to $3.5 million as a condition for denying Ford's request for a new trial. But the message had been sent. While the Grimshaw case was working its way through the California courts, a journalist named Mark Dowie was working on something that would blow the entire scandal wide open. In 1977, Dowie published an investigative article in Mother Jones magazine titled Pinto Madness. The article used internal Ford documents, many of which came from the files of the Center for Auto Safety, a consumer advocacy group. Dowie laid out in excruciating detail the story of how Ford knew the Pinto's fuel system was dangerous, how they calculated the cost of human life versus the cost of a fix, and how they chose profit over people. The article called the Pinto a fire trap and a death trap. It estimated that between 500 and 900 people had burned to death in Pinto crashes. People who, Dowie argued, would not have been killed or even seriously injured if the car had not burst into flames. The article was sensational, emotional, and devastating to Ford's reputation. Now, it's worth noting that some of those claims have been contested over the years. Later scholarly analysis suggested that the actual number of fire-related deaths was significantly lower than Mother Jones estimated, possibly as low as 27, according to NHTSA's own investigation. Researchers also pointed out that the Pinto's behind-the-axle fuel tank placement was common practice at the time, and that the car's overall fatality rates were comparable to other subcompacts of the era. The infamous Pinto memo was also later revealed to have been prepared not as an internal Ford decision-making tool, but as a document attached to a letter sent to NHTSA about proposed regulations, using life value figures that NHTSA itself had provided. But none of those nuances mattered in the court of public opinion. The damage was done. The Pinto was branded as a killer. The Mother Jones article didn't just damage Ford's reputation, it forced the government's hand. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had actually been petitioned back in 1974 by the Center for Auto Safety to investigate the Pinto's fuel system, after attorneys reported 3 deaths and 4 serious injuries from moderate-speed rear-end collisions. But NHTSA had declined, citing insufficient evidence. After Dowie's article exploded into the public consciousness, and especially after consumer advocate Ralph Nader held a press conference demanding action, NHTSA opened a second investigation in August of 1977. This time, they weren't going to let it go. The investigation included consumer complaints, Ford's own data, examination of accident statistics, and new crash tests, commissioned specifically by the agency. The results were damning. In May of 1978, NHTSA informed Ford that the Pinto's fuel system was defective. Their conclusion stated that 1971 through 1976 Ford Pintos had experienced moderate-speed rear-end collisions that resulted in fuel tank damage, fuel leakage, and fires that had caused fatalities. On June 9, 1978, Ford agreed to recall approximately 1.5 million Pintos, along with 30,000 Mercury Bobcats, the Pinto's sister vehicle. The recall modifications included a longer fuel filler neck, better clamps to keep it attached to the tank, improved gas caps on some models, and plastic shields placed between the fuel tank and the differential housing, and along the right corner of the tank near the shock absorber. Basic protections that could have been there from day one. But here's the gut-wrenching part. Recall notices weren't mailed until September of 1978, and parts weren't available at all dealers until September 15th. In the months between the recall announcement and the actual availability of parts, 6 more people died in Pinto fires after rear-end impacts. 6 more people after Ford had already admitted the problem. The most heartbreaking chapter of the Pinto story began on a summer evening in August of 1978, just 2 months after Ford announced its recall. Judy Ann Ulrich, an 18-year-old recent high school graduate, was driving her yellow 1973 Ford Pinto down U.S. Highway 33 near Elkhart, Indiana. In the car with her were her 16-year-old sister, Lynn Marie, and their 18-year-old cousin, Donna. The 3 girls were headed to a church-sponsored volleyball game. Judy had bought the Pinto with her father as a high school graduation present. At some point, the girls decided to pull over. Their Pinto slowed and stopped on the right-hand lane of the highway. A Chevrolet van, driven by a man named Robert Duggar, came up behind them. Witnesses estimated the closing speed was significant, though exact figures were disputed at trial. The van slammed into the rear of the Pinto. At first, the collision didn't look catastrophic, but then fuel began leaking from the ruptured tank. There was a flicker of flame at the rear of the car, and then an explosion. One eyewitness, Alfred Clark, later told reporters that the Pinto blew up like a napalm bomb. Lynn Marie and Donna were killed almost instantly. Judy was pulled from the wreckage and rushed to the hospital, where she died about 8 hours later from her burns. The girl's mother, Mattie Ulrich, later testified that she did not receive Ford's recall notice for her Pinto until February of 1979, 6 months after her daughters and niece had burned to death. The deaths of the Ulrich girls triggered something unprecedented in American legal history. Michael Cosentino, the local prosecutor in Elkhart County, persuaded a grand jury to indict the Ford Motor Company on 3 counts of reckless homicide. It was the first time in United States history that criminal homicide charges had been brought against a major corporation. The trial of Indiana versus Ford Motor Company began in January of 1980 in the small town of Winnemac after a change of venue. It was, by any measure, a spectacle. Prosecutor Cosentino operated on a shoestring budget of about $20,000. Ford's legal defense was rumored to cost around $1 million. The lead defense attorney was James Neal, one of the most formidable trial lawyers in the country. Cosentino's case was straightforward. He argued that Ford management deliberately chose profit over human life. He told the jury that former Ford employees and company documents would show that management knew the Pinto fuel system was unsafe, and that a $6 per car improvement could have prevented the fuel from leaking in rear-end collisions. The prosecution called expert witnesses who brought in the rear half of a 1973 Pinto for the jury to examine, showing them the hostile environment around the fuel tank, the protruding bolts, the sharp edges, the complete lack of protection. Neal's defense was aggressive and effective. He argued that other compact cars of the era would have performed similarly when hit from behind. He noted that Ford's own engineers had bought Pintos for personal use, suggesting they believed the car was safe. And, crucially, the judge limited the question of recklessness to a narrow window. Whether Ford had been too slow in pursuing the recall in the 41 days between the recall announcement and the accident that killed the Ulrich girls. After 2 months of testimony and several days of deliberation, the jury of 7 men and 5 women returned a verdict, not guilty. Jurors later said they believed Ford had been negligent, but that the prosecution hadn't proven the case rose to the level required for a criminal conviction under Indiana's homicide statute. The verdict was crushing for the prosecution and for the Ulrich family. But the trial itself had already changed history. For the first time, a corporation had been forced to sit in a criminal courtroom and answer for the deaths caused by its products. The precedent was set, even if the conviction wasn't. The Pinto limped along in production until July of 1980, when Ford finally pulled the plug after a total run of more than 3 million vehicles. By then, the car's reputation was thoroughly destroyed. Ford's designated replacement was the front-wheel drive Escort, a clean break from everything the Pinto represented. Lee Iacocca, the man who had championed the Pinto and pushed it through production at breakneck speed, was fired by Ford chairman Henry Ford II in July of 1978, though officially for reasons unrelated to the Pinto scandal. He would go on to become chairman of Chrysler, where he famously saved that company from bankruptcy. He never publicly expressed regret for the Pinto. In fact, his most notable comment about the affair was remarkably cold. He later said that clamming up was what Ford did in the late 70s when they were bombarded with lawsuits over the Pinto, and that keeping their mouths shut for fear of saying anything that might be construed as an admission of guilt was the priority. Winning in court was everything. Nothing else mattered. The Grimshaw case, the Indiana criminal trial, and the Pinto memo together created what scholars call the Pinto narrative, a paradigmatic example of corporate preference for profits over human safety. Both Time and Forbes named the Pinto one of the worst cars of all time. Popular Mechanics called it possibly the best example of what happens when poor engineering meets corporate negligence. The case has been taught in business schools, law schools, and engineering ethics courses for nearly 5 decades. It fundamentally changed how Americans think about corporate responsibility and product safety. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because history is never as simple as a magazine headline. In the decades since the scandal, several scholars have pushed back against the conventional Pinto narrative. A 1991 Rutgers Law Review article by former UCLA law professor Gary Schwartz argued that significant factual misconceptions surrounded the public's understanding of the case. The NHTSA investigation had found 27 deaths attributable to Pinto fuel system fires between 1970 and mid-1977. 27, not 500, not 900, 27. And that was the same number of deaths attributed to a completely separate Pinto transmission problem that caused stalling and subsequent collisions. Some researchers also noted that the Pinto's fire-related fatality rate was comparable to, and in some cases lower than, other subcompact cars of the era, including several popular imports. The behind-the-axle fuel tank placement, often cited as the Pinto's fatal design flaw, was standard practice for American subcompacts at the time. The Pinto memo itself has been re-examined. As mentioned earlier, it was prepared for NHTSA as part of Ford's objection to proposed regulations, not as an internal decision-making document. The $200,000 value assigned to human life came from NHTSA's own guidelines, not from Ford's imagination. None of this excuses what happened. People died in burning Pintos who would have survived the same crashes in a car with a properly protected fuel tank. Ford's engineers knew about the vulnerability and proposed cheap fixes that were rejected. The fundamental ethical failure, choosing schedule and cost over known safety risks, was real. But the story is more nuanced than the popular version suggests. The Pinto wasn't uniquely dangerous for its class and era. It was, however, uniquely exposed. The combination of the Mother Jones article, the Grimshaw verdict, and the unprecedented criminal prosecution created a narrative so powerful that it transcended the specific facts and became a parable about corporate greed. The legacy of the Ford Pinto extends far beyond one controversial car. The scandal was a catalyst for sweeping changes in how America regulates automotive safety. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 301, which governs fuel system integrity in rear-end crashes, was strengthened directly as a result of the Pinto controversy. The standard had been delayed for years, partly due to lobbying from Ford and other automakers. After the scandal broke, those delays became indefensible. The Grimshaw verdict sent a seismic message to the entire automotive industry. As the Los Angeles Times later wrote, it signaled that automakers would be harshly sanctioned for ignoring known defects. The era of safety doesn't sell was over. Within years, automakers began not just accepting safety regulations, but actively marketing safety features as selling points. The Indiana criminal trial, despite the acquittal, established the legal principle that corporations could be held criminally accountable for deaths caused by their products. That precedent has been invoked in cases far beyond the automotive industry. And perhaps most importantly, the Pinto case gave birth to a new era of consumer advocacy and investigative journalism around product safety. It proved that internal corporate documents could be brought to light, that whistleblowers like Harley Kopp could make a difference, and that public pressure could force even the most powerful corporations to change course. Every time you see a modern car's crumple zones, reinforced fuel systems, multiple airbags, and crash test ratings proudly displayed in advertisements, you're seeing the direct descendants of lessons learned from the Ford Pinto. Every time a corporation thinks twice before cutting a safety corner to save a few dollars per unit, somewhere in the back of their mind is the ghost of a $2,000 car that burned. And that's the dark story behind the Ford Pinto's engine bay, a car that was born from ambition and impatience, designed under impossible deadlines, and sold to millions of families who had no idea what they were really driving. The engineers knew, the executives knew, and they made a choice. Some of those choices can never be undone. So the next time someone tells you that safety regulations are just red tape and government overreach, remember the Pinto, remember Lily Gray, remember Richard Grimshaw, remember Judy, Lynn, and Donna Ulrich. And remember that sometimes the difference between life and death is a $1 piece of plastic that somebody decided wasn't worth the cost. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Should Ford have faced harsher consequences? We'll see you in the next one.